Hey, I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is Sam IT, and in today's episode, we're going to be doing a kind of technical, but more for business talk about what are the components of web hosting.
NTG, supporting business and technology globally since 1999.
Every business, okay, there's an exception somewhere, but every business has a website today, right? We all do. We may have 100 websites. We need them for everything, right? We make them for the company party, let alone the actual business itself. We use them for all kinds of things. They're really important. So understanding what goes into a website and what even is a website is really important from a business perspective, because as someone who advises companies, I see this almost every day where people are getting the basics wrong. And I don't just mean companies getting this wrong. IT departments often get this wrong because web hosting is somehow just not something we actually do often enough that we actually don't understand it in many cases. So some quick high-level understanding of what a website is and how it works really can help us understand who needs to be involved and why certain people need to be the ones in charge of certain things and who to go to get things fixed and all that. So let's get started. First of all, what is a website? Well, at its most basic, a website is basically a file, like a Word document or a text file, right? Maybe a spreadsheet. And that is then served out by a server. I do it, it's actually a server. And when we go to it with our web browser, we're requesting that file. That's kind of as simple as it gets. So technically a web server is a file server. The thing that we're serving out, the website, is a file, and our browser is just a viewing device for viewing that file. We could actually build the web on, say, PDFs, right? Instead of making a website, we could make a PDF that looks kind of like a website, that has all the same information on it. We could put that on a file server that may or may not be a web server, right? It may not use HTTP like we're used to. Maybe it uses FTP or some other protocol, NFS, SMB, doesn't matter, right? Any protocol that lets us get a copy of that file. And then instead of a web browser, we could use Adobe Acrobat or a web browser because they all show PDFs now anyway, right? And then we open that PDF. Essentially, we just rebuilt the web in just a slower, not quite as convenient sort of way, but it would work. And that's basically what's going on. Someone makes a PDF that looks nice, we hope. Somebody stores it and hands it out when people ask for it, and something displays it. That's all we're doing on a website. We're just using HTTP as the protocol for transferring the files around. We're using web browsers as the thing for viewing it, and the files that we're looking at are HTML files. That's the basics. Now, where did the different actual roles come into play as we're doing this? Well, first of all, we have our web designer. What's weird is if we were making a PDF, we would probably just do it ourselves and give it to the receptionist and let him whip it up, right? Put some logos on a PDF, pick out a nice font, save his PDF. Done. When we're making a website, we tend to be like, wow, we really want this to be like way better than just that PDF we would have whipped up. So we tend to hire a graphic designer who specializes in web technologies. This is a web designer. Now, these vary a lot, the people who do web design. You will find some people who have no idea of what they're building, and they just use some high-level tools, put a bunch of pictures together, and it looks good, and we tend to have lots of problems with it. And when you ask them, hey, how does this work? They have no idea. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have pretty serious developers who are writing all kinds of code and putting everything together themselves and really getting deep into writing the system themselves and everything in between. So you get a very big variance in how a designer approaches a website, plus not even looking at how good they are graphically, right? So you may have someone all across the spectrum, of course, in quality, right? Where the website looks terrible or looks great from first glance, but there's also a lot of questions around security, performance, SEO, and other things that all come from the web designer. So it is a graphic design discipline. It is a very visual, very design-oriented marketing and graphical role, but it is also a highly technical one where there's a lot of ways and important factors about how a website is going to behave that are determined by the web designer. And we won't go into those details here, other than to mention it is at this stage that decisions like Jamstacks or purely static websites that are manual HTML or pre-generated things or content management systems like WordPress and such, those decisions are being made by your web designer, and those decisions can be pretty big in how they impact you long-term throughout your entire web hosting process, right? So it's pretty important that the web designer not work in a vacuum, and extremely important that they be part of your IT ecosystem. That doesn't mean that they need to be part of your IT team, of course, because making a website is probably a one-off for your organization. I know for us, when we're making our main corporate website, that's something we do once every, say, 4 or 5 years. And so when we do that, it's kind of a specialty undertaking. We don't make it every week or anything. So we don't have a person who's constantly making that website over and over and over again. So we want someone who's a specialty web designer who is knowledgeable and able to do lots of different things and do whatever is right for us, whatever that ends up being, who can sit down with all the other components that we're going to talk about, the people who are involved in those components, discuss what is needed for us as an organization, and build the right look to the website, but also the right behavior to the website to do the right thing for us. This is a step almost every company overlooks. They all go to a designer. They never have them interface with IT. They never look into the IT background of that company. I can't tell you how many designers I've worked with who, when I ask, how does your website work? They look at me with a blank stare. They don't even know. They're using tools at such a high level. They're not sure what they've made, and they're not sure, in many cases, how to get me a copy of the website. That's how non-technical you'll often get. And that can lead to some pretty big problems when you're dealing with performance or security or changes in the future, or just needing to host it somewhere, right? If they can't get you a copy of the website, what are you going to do? How are you going to get it hosted? You have a problem, right? So that first piece needs to be part of the ecosystem. Somebody has to oversee that, or you're going to have maybe not major problems, but you're definitely going to have negative connotations that you may never realize, because these things are hard to measure. And this is why people get away with this, and companies get away with just ignoring this process all the time, because there's no way to really directly correlate that this first decision of choosing your web designer and them not working to make sure you're getting the right technology the whole way through and having all the right communications throughout this process. You'll never realize that your Google rankings are directly impacted by that. You'll never realize that your web hosting costs and your IT cost and your downtime are all 5 years from now being impacted by this decision of what you feel is a graphic design or marketing function, right? But it's a ripple effect that's going to affect you for a long time, but one you will simply never correlate. But a good IT professional will come in and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how many problems and how many hours and how many thousands of dollars have been lost because of this crazy decision that nobody took the time to oversee at the beginning. This is part of IT. Why wasn't IT involved? Why isn't a top-down management thing? Oh, we didn't think to engage the people who would have to deal with it later. Okay, right. It's a big deal. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is your actual web hosting. So someone has to run a server that is going to host the website. And this may sound pretty simple, and it would be if all we needed to do was just be able to host a website. But we need it to be fast, we need it to be secure, we need it to be maintained, we need it to do a lot of things. So this is not a completely casual decision, and it's not one that can be made in a vacuum. Depending on the decisions made by the web designer, will change which companies and products we can use for web hosting. Again, you need someone in IT overseeing all these things. Now, there are some pretty simple, bad default choices that everybody makes that are costly, slow, and problematic, but they generally work if you just don't put in any effort into all these decisions. You can get a website that will probably come up. It will be slow. It will not get great Google rankings. It will be unnecessarily costly for you as an organization. It will not have the features that you wish you had or don't realize you could have had, but it will probably work. And that is how most companies function. But they only work by going with relatively bad conventions that everybody goes with, right? So with your web host, you have actually quite a few things that happen there, because your web host may be the only people who have access to certain parts of your code. You may need to do things at that code level that involves either your web host or your IT department working with that web host, or maybe the web host is part of your IT department, in order to make changes or to do updates or to do tweaks. There are things that the web host do that may need to interact with the design. So for example, really common things we deal with all the time: the database that is used by your web host, the web server that they run, any caches that they run, such as memcached or Redis. These things all need to react properly with the website. Now, why is that? This is worth stepping back for a second, and I don't want to get too technical because I do assume that most of the audience for this particular video are business people, not technical people. But most websites, right, when we make them, at first we talk about it's like a PDF or a Word document, right? It's really simple. It's just a document. It should be in most cases. But what tends to happen, and this is one of the mistakes that people make, is that the designer will generally default to using a content management system that they like to use. You've heard of these all the time. WordPress is far and away the largest, and that is not to say that WordPress is not an excellent product. It is, but it is not appropriate for most use cases. It is a product great for a few use cases that gets used for all kinds of things, because designers tend to learn it early. It does a lot of the work for them, and it allows them to probably only learn one thing and kind of half-ass it for all their clients. So we find that people tend to just assume you're going to deploy WordPress, and that's what's going to happen all through the entire chain. Everyone's going to assume it's going to be WordPress, but it may or may not be. The decisions made by the web designer affect how your web server can run, because something like WordPress is not just a document. It's actually an application, a big application. It is a ton and ton of code that generates a document on the fly. We call this dynamically generated. Don't need to get into the details, but basically it's the difference between if you go to a clerk in a government office and you say, I need this file. Well, if it's a piece of paper that they have already and they simply pull it out of a drawer and hand it to you, that would be a static file. But if it's the same piece of paper, but it's blank, and they go and they pull data from 40 different files and they fill out a form and generate that file form and then hand it to you, that would be dynamically generated. What's happening with WordPress and a lot of other content management systems is that at the time that you request a document, that is, your browser asks for a website from the server, it says, okay, I don't have a piece of paper to hand out here. I need to go to a database and pull a bunch of pieces. I have to go onto my file system and find some pictures. I have to go find a font. I have to go find some code. I have to go find some bunch of things. I'm going to assemble them all, do a bit of work on it, maybe add a timestamp, maybe add a location, maybe ask the browser some information and make some tweaks based on that, then send the final document after I do a bunch of work off to the browser for it to see, and the browser still feels that it's getting just a document. It doesn't realize that behind the scenes, the server was putting that document together on the fly. But that means that you have an application server, not just a web server. And that application server potentially does a lot of work and a lot of things that can break. And as someone who manages a lot of different types of web servers, you have a lot of different technologies that may be happening back there. And you have to deal with versions of programming languages. You have to deal with plugins and components and libraries and all kinds of things, and caches and the databases. And you may have multiple databases. And there's a lot that goes into this. Now, if you're running WordPress, it's mostly pretty straightforward because we all manage WordPress all the time. So there's a lot of conventions we can just stick with. But if you're doing anything else, and in many cases you should be, then you may need to worry about the version of PHP that you're running, or which cache makes the most sense, or which plugins in WordPress make the most sense. And this gets even hairier because in many cases, even with WordPress, there are many different cache options and web server options and database options that you can choose in different scenarios. And in order for WordPress to work the best with whatever one you have, you need to add or modify the code in WordPress or add plugins to it that talk to those pieces. A really common example is you may have a varnish cache, which is a very high performance cache to speed up how quickly WordPress is able to dynamically generate those documents. But to make varnish work really well, you need a varnish plugin inside of WordPress so that WordPress itself, sitting up here on the stack, is able to talk to the varnish cache and coordinate with it so that varnish knows exactly what WordPress is thinking and vice versa. If you don't do that, your varnish cache may not do what it's supposed to do. It may not perform as well as it should. It may serve out bad data. So there's a lot of technical pieces here that almost everybody overlooks. The only person who's responsible for all this is IT. It is not the job of the web host to know what you're running on it. It's not the job of the web designer to know what your web host is doing, right? It's not the job of the software people to know how you're going to use it. The only person who, in a normal organization, in any way has a role here that oversees these pieces is your IT department. But they're rarely brought in to look at this. Now, it goes farther. In today's world, we never, in a production website, simply run it in that way. We also have what's known as a reverse proxy that sits in front of this. The most common one is Cloudflare, which we also talked about in another video about that they provide DNS. That is also true. Them providing DNS is part of how they handle the reverse proxy mechanisms. Cloudflare handles things like TLS performance offloading and front caching and geolocation caching of website data for your web hosting. And this can play a significant factor in how fast your site works, how well it works, how secure it is, and most importantly, probably how well it ranks on websites. But in order for this to work well, somebody has to know all these other pieces. You can use Cloudflare or another reverse proxy without knowing how everything works, but it's not going to work as well. In the case of WordPress, for example, we again need a plugin on the web server that talks to the reverse proxy at Cloudflare to coordinate what it is caching. And that is something that, again, your web host has no knowledge of, and it is not their responsibility. It is not the person managing DNS's responsibility. At some point, it is IT's responsibility to oversee all of these IT functions and put them together into a holistic web hosting web stack, right? You have the TLS security, who's handling the actual certificates, who's handling the way that security is handled, who's handling the caching at the reverse proxy layer. It is only IT can handle knowing who your strategy for your TLS and your certificates, and the strategy for your reverse proxy and the cache at the edge, and then mirroring or marrying that to your strategy for your caches and your security at the web host, and combining that with the application layer decisions that are happening, whether it's a static site or it's a Jamstack or it's a content management system like WordPress, and having all the modules and components and configuration that need to happen there, and marrying that to the application and design decisions that are happening all the way back at the designer. All of this is one big cohesive whole, even though it may feel like, well, we're having this designer do something now, and 5 years from now, what do you mean that affects my proxy decisions years from now? But it does. This whole thing needs to be strategized together, because it is only by putting it all together that we're able to get maximum performance, the best SEO, the best security, the best management, the uptime. Right? All of these pieces go together. The decisions at the designer level, the decisions at the proxy level, and everything in between all come together for every aspect of what you're doing. If you want your site to always be there and always look good and perform well and grow with you and be able to be changed, you need a strategy that puts these all together. And you need to understand that only IT has the capability of handling all these pieces. It is extremely technical. There is a lot to manage. There's a lot going on. And if IT doesn't understand all the different roles, you have a problem, because there's no people to do these things. The designer is never going to know stuff about web hosting. The two just don't go together. You may be able to find a firm that does both, but designers and web hosts, webmasters and systems administrators who run web servers, they're completely different job roles. They do not overlap. No, and it doesn't make any sense for them to. You would never expect to find them to. And the people who do web hosting, it is not their job to know your TLS and reverse proxy strategy. That is a separate role. And it's where your DNS is managed, or it's at least tied to where your DNS is managed. That's not their job. In many cases, they'll do your DNS for you, but they're not going to do all the stuff that you want them to do with the DNS. They're just going to make sure that your website is up. So when you say, hey, I paid $10 a month for my website, is it there? They go, yes, I can show you it's there. And I took care of your DNS, don't worry about it. And you go, oh, nice. And you just give them their $10 every month, and you ignore the fact that there's this bigger picture being ignored because it's not their problem. It's not their job. They expect you to have your IT overseeing this. They're just a vendor providing you this one piece for your IT to manage. No different than if you went to a phone vendor and you got phones from them and then you had a problem with your desktop. Your phone vendor is not going to voluntarily fix your desktop. It's a different job. You didn't hire them for that. They're not paid for that. They're not trained for that. And they have no reason to think that you would expect them to know anything about that. But for some reason with websites, a lot of companies, I'm going to go with 90% of companies, actually think that by getting a blind web host where you're simply buying one really cheap piece of hosting with no other oversight and with no interaction with your business, that somehow they're going to, one, be accountable and knowledgeable and go out of their way to do all the things that may or may not need to be done, and that they're able to, right? Because they don't have access to these things. How could they do these things, right? And then the question, of course, comes up, well, and this always comes up right with businesses, how are we supposed to know these things? This is very simple. There is really no getting around the fact that every piece of this is clearly IT, and that absolutely IT should have been involved in every step all of the time. If your IT department says, I don't know anything about this stuff, then you need to find an IT department that does, or have your IT department reach out to the right resources. There's nothing wrong with your IT department not knowing everything about everything, because IT is too big. You can't have a single, especially if you're a small company, you have a single person, they can't know all the pieces. You shouldn't expect them to. But what you should expect them to do is go out and find the right resources. That's probably in a small company, that's the biggest part of their job. But you as the business person should know that when you're dealing with server hosting, technical applications, anything having to do with your technical business infrastructure, that your business infrastructure team, that's what IT is, needs to be involved. Because otherwise, where do you draw the line to stop involving the experts? It's really close to being called into court and having the company be sued for something really dramatic and not bothering to call your lawyer. Sure, you're allowed to. It's your business. You can represent yourself in court, but you have an attorney for this exact purpose. And this is where you have IT for this exact purpose, to oversee your business infrastructure. If you're not leveraging them for this, what are you leveraging them for? This is where they really start to pay off. I know that's a bit, but this is, I think, really important because every business needs to understand what these pieces are and why there has to be IT oversight. And trust me, you can go to an MSP for this, you can go to an ITSP for this, you can go to your IT department for this. Everybody should have some way to get this handled. If you feel that you don't have an organization that can get these resources, you're too small, your IT department can't handle it, then you need to reach out and find partners who are able to provide this, someone that will work with your existing IT department and fill in these gaps. At the end of this video, we are sponsored by NTG and Hostadillo, who work to do exactly these things, but there are countless companies that do. Feel free to reach out to us. There's a decent chance you're getting this video from one of us because we're sending it to you. But if you want to get these resources, your IT department should be able to find all the right people to put these things together and oversee this and show them this video, right? Because they can watch this video and say, oh, okay, yeah, I know all those pieces. I can do all that. Need me to oversee that? I'm on it. And if they say, oh, I'm not really familiar with those things. I've heard some of the terms, but I wouldn't be comfortable. Nothing wrong with that, right? tell them you need to find someone who's going to fill in this gap for you. This is not an expensive role, but it is going to be expensive if you don't have the infrastructure of your business run correctly. May not hit you hard today, but it's going to hit you hard at some point distant in the future. And you may not come to realize at the time that our website's been slow or down or expensive to fix all this time because we didn't have a handle on the whole picture. We just kind of got swept along with the current. Take the time to protect your business so that you're ready for whatever comes along. Business infrastructure is important in every business. Thanks for joining me. Remember that we are sponsored by companies who help with exactly this stuff. I myself work for NTG. I have been there at this point for 22 years. I'm very proud of the work that we do. We specifically do this kind of work along with many other things in IT. And we have our own division that does web hosting, which is Hostadillo. And we specifically work all the way through the stack. We are one of the rare companies who has our own web design department, our own web hosting department, and IT outsourcing to oversee the entire ecosystem, along with branding and marketing resources. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.
Hostadillo, more than just hosting, a holistic business-centered solution encompassing every aspect of your web presence.